Chapter 13. I was aware of rushing, but it was the soul in me that rushed. It experienced dizzy, unutterable alterations. Thousands of emotions, intense and varied, poured through me at lightning speed, each satisfyingly known, yet gone before its name appeared. The life of many centuries tore headlong back with me, and, as in drowning, this epitome of existence shot in a few seconds the steep slopes the past had so laboriously built up. The changes flashed and passed. I wept and prayed and worshipped. I loved and suffered. I battled, lost, and won. Down the gigantic scale of ages that telescoped thus into a few brief moments, the soul in me went sliding backwards towards a motionless, reposeful past. I remember foolish details that interrupted the immense descent. I put on coat and hat. I remember someone's words, strangely sounding as when some bird wakes up and sings at midnight. "We'll take the little door, the front one's locked by now." And I have a vague recollection of the outline of the great hotel, with its colonnades and terraces, fading behind me through the air. But these details merely flickered and disappeared, as though I fell earthwards from a star and passed feathers or blown leaves upon the way. There was no friction as my soul dropped backwards into time. The flight was easy and silent as a dream. I felt myself sucked down into gulfs whose emptiness offered no resistance, until at last the appalling speed decreased of its own accord, and the dizzy flight became a kind of gentle floating. It changed imperceptibly into a gliding motion, as though the angle altered. My feet, quite naturally, were on the ground, moving through something soft that clung to them, and rustled while it clung. I looked up and saw the bright armies of the stars. In front of me I recognized the flat-topped, shadowy ridges. On both sides lay the open expanses of familiar wilderness, and beside me, one on either hand, moved two figures who were my companions. We were in the desert, but it was the desert of thousands of years ago. My companions, moreover, though familiar to some part of me, seemed strangers or half-known. Their names I strove in vain to capture. Mosley, Ilson, sounded in my head, mingled together falsely. And when I stole a glance at them, I saw the dark lines of mannequins, unfilled with substance, and was aware of the grotesque gestures of living hieroglyphics. It seemed for an instant that their arms were bound behind their backs impossibly, and that their heads turned sharply across their lineal shoulders. But for a moment only, for at a second glance I saw them solid and compact. Their names came back to me. Our arms were linked together as we walked. We had already covered a great distance, for my limbs were aching and my breath was short. The air was cold, the silence absolute. It seemed in this faint light that the desert flowed beneath our feet, rather than that we advanced by taking steps. Cliffs with hooded tops moved past us, boulders glided, mounds of sand slid by, and then I heard a voice upon my left that was surely Molson speaking. "Towards Enet our feet are set," he half sang, half murmured. "Towards Enet-te-ntōrē. There, in the house of birth, we shall dedicate our hearts and lives anew." And the language, no less than the musical intonation of his voice, enraptured me. For I understood he spoke of Dendera, in whose majestic temple recent hands had painted with deathless colors the symbols of our cosmic relationships with the zodiacal signs. And Dendera was our great seat of worship of the goddess Hathor, the Egyptian Aphrodite, bringer of love and joy. The falcon-headed Horus was her husband, from whom, in his home at Edfu, we imbibed swift kinds of power, and it was the time of the new year, the great feast, when the forces of the living earth turn upwards into happy growth. We were on foot across the desert towards Dendera, and this sand we trod was the sand of thousands of years ago. The paralysis of time and distance involved some amazing lightness of the spirit that, I suppose, touched ecstasy. There was intoxication in the soul. I was not divided from the stars, nor separate from this desert that rushed with us. The unhampered wind blew freshly from my nerves and skin, and the Nile, glimmering faintly on our right, lay with its lapping waves in both my hands. I knew the life of Egypt, for it was in me, over me, round me. I was a part of it. We went happily, like birds, to meet the sunrise. There were no pits of measured time and interval that could detain us. We flowed, yet we were at rest. We were endlessly alive. Present and future alike were inconceivable. We were in the kingdom of the past. The pyramids were just a building, and the army of obelisks looked about them, proud of their first balance. Thebes swung her 100 gates upon the world. New, shining Memphis glittered with myriad reflections into waters that the tears of Isis sweetened, and the cliffs of Abou Simbel were still innocent of their gigantic progeny. Alone, the Sphinx, linking timelessness with time, brooded unguessed and underived upon an alien world. We marched within antiquity towards Dendera. How long we marched, how fast, how far we went, I can remember as little as the marvelous speech that passed across me while my two companions spoke together. I only remember that suddenly a wave of pain disturbed my wondrous happiness and caused my calm, which had seemed beyond all reach of break, to fall away. I heard their voices abruptly with a kind of terror. A sensation of fear, of loss, of nightmare bewilderment came over me like cold wind. What they lived naturally, true to their inmost hearts, I lived merely by means of a temperamental sympathy. And the stage had come at which my powers failed. Exhaustion overtook me. I wilted. The strain, the abnormal backwards stretch of consciousness that was put upon me by another, gave way and broke. I heard their voices, faint and horrible. My joy was extinguished. A glare of horror fell upon the desert, and the stars seemed evil. An anguishing desire for the safe and wholesome present usurped all this mad yearning to obtain the past. My feet fell out of step. The rushing of the desert paused. I unlinked my arms. We stopped, all three. The actual spot is to this day well known to me. I found it afterwards. I even photographed it. It lies actually not far from Helouan, a few miles at most beyond the solitary palm, where slopes of undulating sand mark the opening of a strange, enticing valley called the Wadi Jirawi, and it is enticing because it beckons and leads on. Here, amid torn gorges of a limestone wilderness, there is suddenly soft yellow sand that flows and draws the feet onward. It slips away with one too easily. Always the next ridge and basin must be seen, each time a little farther. It has the quality of decoying. The cliffs say no, but this streaming sand invites. In its flowing curves of gold there is enchantment. And it was here, upon its very lips, we stopped. The rhythm of our steps broken, our hearts no longer one. My temporary rapture vanished. I was aware of fear. For the present rushed upon me with attack in it, and I felt that my mind was arrested close upon the edge of madness. Something cleared and lifted in my brain. The soul, indeed, could choose its dwelling place, but to live elsewhere completely was the choice of madness, and to live divorced from all the sweet wholesome business of today involved an exile that was worse than madness. It was death. My heart burned for George Isley. I remembered the tear upon his cheek. The agony of his struggle I shared suddenly with him. Yet with him was the reality, with me a sympathetic reflection merely. He was already too far gone to fight. I shall never forget the desolation of that strange scene beneath the morning stars. The desert lay down and watched us. We stood upon the brink of a little broken ridge, looking into the valley of golden sand. This sand gleamed soft and wonderful in the starlight, some 20 feet below. The descent was easy, but I would not move. I refused to advance another step. I saw my companions in the mysterious half-light beside me, peering over the edge, Molson in front a little. And I turned to him, sure of the part I meant to play, yet conscious painfully of my helplessness. My personality seemed a straw in midstream that spun in a futile effort to arrest the flood that bore it. There was vivid human conflict in the moment's silence. It was an eddy that paused in the great body of the tide. And then I spoke. Oh, I was ashamed of the insignificance of my voice and the weakness of my little personality. Molson, we go no farther with you. We have already come too far. We now turn back. Behind my words were a paltry 30 years. His answer drove 60 centuries against me. For his voice was like the wind that passed whispering down the stream of yellow sand below us. He smiled. Our feet are set towards Enet-te-ntōrē. There is no turning back. Listen, it is calling, calling, calling. We will go home, I cried, in a tone I vainly strove to make imperative. Our home is there, he sang, pointing with one long thin arm towards the brightening east. For the temple calls us, and the river takes our feet. We shall be in the house of birth to meet the sunrise. You lie, I cried again. You speak the lies of madness, and this past you seek is the house of death. It is the kingdom of the underworld. The words tore wildly, impotently out of me. I seized George Isley's arm. Come back with me, I pleaded vehemently, my heart aching with a nameless pain for him. We'll retrace our steps. Come home with me. Come back. Listen, the present calls you sweetly. His arm slipped horribly out of my grasp that had seemed to hold it so tightly. Molson, already below us in the yellow sand, looked small with distance. He was gliding rapidly farther with uncanny swiftness. The diminution of his form was ghastly. It was like a doll's, and his voice rose up, faint as with the distance of great gulfs of space. Calling, calling, you hear it forever calling. It died away with the wind along that sandy valley, and the past swept in a flood across the brightening sky. I swayed as though a storm was at my back. I reeled. Almost I went too, over the crumbling edge into the sand. Come back with me. Come home, I cried more faintly. The present alone is real. There is work, ambition, duty. There is beauty, too, the beauty of good living. And there is love. There is a woman calling, calling. That other voice took up the word below me. I heard the faint refrain sing down the sandy walls. The wild, sweet pang in it was marvelous. Our feet are set for Enet-te-ntōrē. It is calling, calling. My voice fell into nothingness. George Isley was below me now, his outline tiny against the sheet of yellow sand, and the sand was moving. The desert rushed again. The human figures receded swiftly into the past they had reconstructed with the creative yearning of their souls. I stood alone upon the edge of crumbling limestone, helplessly watching them. It was amazing what I witnessed, while the shafts of crimson dawn rose up the sky. The enormous desert turned alive to the horizon with gold and blue and silver. The purple shadows melted into gray. The flat-topped ridges shone. Huge messengers of light flashed everywhere at once. The radiance of sunrise dazzled my outer sight. But if my eyes were blinded, my inner sight was focused the more clearly upon what followed. I witnessed the disappearance of George Isley. There was a dreadful magic in the picture. The pair of them, small and distant below me in that little sandy hollow, stood out sharply defined as in a miniature. I saw their outlines, neat and terrible, like some ghastly inset against the enormous scenery. Though so close to me in actual space, they were centuries away in time. And a dim, vast shadow was about them that was not mere shadow of the ridges. It encompassed them. It moved, crawling over the sand, obliterating them. Within it, like insects lost in amber, they became visibly imprisoned, dwindled in size, borne deep away, absorbed. And then I recognized the outline. Once more, but this time recumbent, and spread flat upon the desert's face. I knew the monstrous shapes of the twin obsessing symbols. The spirit of ancient Egypt lay over all the land, tremendous in the dawn. The sunrise summoned her. She lay prostrate before the deity. The shadows of the towering colossi lay prostrate too. The little humans, with their worshipping and conquered hearts, lay deep within them. George Isley I saw clearest. The distinctness, the reality, were appalling. He was naked, robbed, undressed. I saw him, a skeleton, picked clean to the very bones as by an acid. His life lay hid in the being of that mighty past. Egypt had absorbed him. He was gone. I closed my eyes, but I could not keep them closed. They opened of their own accord. The three of us were nearing the great hotel that rose yellow with shuttered windows in the early sunshine. The wind blew briskly from the north across the Mokattam hills. There were soft cannonball clouds dotted about the sky, and across the Nile, where the mist lay in a line of white, I saw the tops of the pyramids gleaming like mountain peaks of gold. A string of camels, laden with white stone, went past us. I heard the crying of the natives in the streets of Helwan, and as we went up the steps, the donkeys arrived and camped in the sandy road beside their bersim till the tourists claimed them. "Good morning," cried Abdullah, the man who owned them. "You will go to Saqqara today, or Memphis. Beautiful day today, and very good donkeys." Molson went up to his room without a word, and Isley did the same. I thought he staggered a moment as he turned the passage corner from my sight. His face wore a look of vacancy that some call peace. There was radiance in it. It made me shudder. Aching in mind and body, and no word spoken, I followed their example. I went upstairs to bed, and slept a dreamless sleep till after sunset.